The cold was a physical presence on the mountain, a thing with weight and texture. It settled in the hollows and clung to the undersides of pine boughs, sharp and clean in the thin air. Rowan felt it not as a discomfort but as a fact, another layer of the silence he had wrapped himself in for the last 5 years. He moved through the stands of lodgepole pine with an economy of motion learned in places far from this quiet slope, his boots making little sound on the carpet of damp needles. The world was shades of gray and deep, wet green, the sky a low ceiling of bruised cloud. Beside him, Sargent moved with the same quiet purpose. The German shepherd was a shadow of black and tan, his dense fur shedding the mist that ghosted through the trees. He was not a pet, he was a partner. His presence was a constant low hum of vigilance that mirrored Rowan's own. The dog's dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing. The flick of a squirrel's tail 100 yards distant, the shift of wind bringing the scent of snow from the higher peaks, the subtle tension in Rowan's shoulders. Rowan wore his olive field jacket, the elbows worn soft, and the collar turned up against the chill. He carried the weight of his past not in his pack, which was light, but in the way he held himself, a coiled stillness that never fully relaxed. His face, framed by a rough, close beard salted with gray, was a map of hard miles and harder memories. He scanned the tree line out of habit, his gaze lingering on the places where shadow pooled deepest, the spaces where things could hide. Isolation was a choice, a discipline. Here, the silence was honest. It didn't pretend to offer comfort, it simply was. They were following a game trail that was little more than a rumor on the forest floor. The routine was the point. Walk the perimeter, check the fences of the small parcel of land he called his, and return before the early dusk swallowed the mountainside. The rhythm of it was a form of prayer, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. Move, observe, breathe. Repeat. Then the rhythm broke. Sargent stopped. It was not a sudden halt, but a fluid cessation of movement, as if the air had thickened around him. His body went rigid, head low, ears canted forward. One front paw lifted slightly from the damp earth. It was a posture Rowan knew better than his own reflection. It was not the alert stance for wildlife, nor the aggressive posture for a threat. This was different. This was confusion. A question mark made of muscle and fur. Rowan stopped a few feet behind him, his hand falling instinctively to the worn grip of the knife on his belt. He listened. There was only the wind, a low moan through the high branches, and the sound of his own breathing, suddenly loud in his ears. He scanned the dense woods ahead. Nothing. No movement. No unnatural shapes. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, the words a puff of white in the cold air. The dog did not look back. His focus was absolute, aimed at a thicket of overgrown rhododendron and fallen logs about 50 yards up the slope. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his nose working the air. A low whine, barely audible, vibrated in his chest. It was a sound of profound uncertainty, a sound Rowan had not heard since their first months together after the service, when the dog was still relearning the world outside of sand and steel. Rowan moved up beside him, his boots sinking into the soft loam. He put a hand on Sargent's neck, the fur coarse and warm beneath his cold fingers. The dog's muscles were bunched and tight. "Easy," Rowan said, more to himself than to the animal. He followed the dog's line of sight. It was just a tangle of wilderness, indistinguishable from the miles of forest surrounding them. But Sargent was adamant. The world had tilted on its axis, and only he had felt the shift. Trust the dog. It was the first rule, the last rule, the only rule that had never failed him. He unclipped the small, powerful flashlight from his pack, though the light was still good. It was habit, preparation. He gave the dog a quiet command, a soft click of the tongue, and they moved forward together, stepping off the trail and into the untracked wild. The air grew colder as they climbed, the scent of pine and wet earth deepening, now mingled with something else, something metallic and wrong, the smell of rust, old, cold rust. It was a scent that belonged to shipyards and forgotten depots, not to this pristine slope. Sargent led him directly to the rhododendron thicket, pushing through the waxy leaves without hesitation. On the other side, the ground fell away into a shallow, moss-lined ravine that the trail had skirted. And there, nestled into the earth as if it had grown there, was the source. It was a vehicle, or what was left of one. An old model ambulance or transport van, painted in a faded, peeling coat of forest green that had been meant as camouflage. It was half swallowed by the landscape, tilted at a drunken angle against the ravine wall, draped in years of fallen leaves and creeping vines. Rust spread across its hull like a slow bleeding wound, a deep, angry orange against the muted green. The windows were gone, dark eyes staring out at nothing. Someone had tried very hard to make this thing disappear. Rowan circled it slowly, Sargent staying so close his flank brushed against Rowan's leg. The dog's posture had changed again. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a tense, investigative focus. His nose was to the ground, then lifted to the air, parsing scents Rowan could only guess at. The vehicle was an antique, maybe from the 80s. A civilian model, but the paint job was military spec, or a very good imitation. He found the rear doors. They were slightly ajar, held shut by a lattice of thick vines. He used his knife to cut them away, the fibrous strands parting with a wet snap. The metal of the doors was cold, pebbled with corrosion. He pulled. They opened with a groan of tortured metal that echoed unnaturally in the quiet woods. The inside was dark and smelled of damp, decay, and something else. Antiseptic. Faint, but there. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a clean white cone through the gloom. The interior had been stripped of most of its medical equipment. In its place were signs of habitation, a small makeshift cot, a stack of empty military-grade ration containers, a water filtration pump, the kind used for long-term backcountry survival, sat neatly in a corner. Someone had lived here, for a long time. He stepped inside, the floor creaking ominously under his weight. Sargent followed, his claws making soft ticking sounds on the metal. The dog immediately went to the far corner, sniffing intently at a small, sealed footlocker. Rowan swept his light across the small space. There were scratches on the interior walls, hash marks counting days. He lost count after 300. Years. Someone had been here for years. His light fell on a set of straps, cut clean through, dangling from a mounting point on the wall where a stretcher would have been secured. Not frayed, not broken. Cut. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate act. Someone had survived a crash, or driven this vehicle here, and stayed. They had planned. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, began to seep into his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He felt the space closing in, the smell of antiseptic and stale air thickening. For a disorienting second, he wasn't in a rusted-out van in Montana. He was in the tight metallic belly of a V-22 Osprey, the air thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone, the deck vibrating with the strain of the rotors. The faces of his team were illuminated in the green glow of the cabin lights, their eyes wide and certain. Marcus was there, clapping him on the shoulder, his grin a flash of white in the gloom. "Just another day at the office, Rowan. Get them out. Get it done." He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the memory back into its box. He focused on the solid, warm presence of Sargent beside him, the dog's wet nose bumping against his hand, grounding him. He opened his eyes. He was back in the van. The green glow was just moss on the window frame. The ghosts were gone, for now. Sargent whined again, a low, insistent sound, and nudged the footlocker with his nose. Rowan knelt beside it. It was a standard-issue military surplus case, but the lock was new, a heavy-duty civilian model. He examined the hinges. They were rusted solid. He wouldn't be opening it here. As he stood, his light caught something on the floor near the cot, a glint of gold. He knelt again, brushing away a layer of dried leaves and dirt. It was a ring. A simple, thin gold band, sized for a woman's hand. It was impossibly clean, as if it had been dropped only yesterday. He picked it up. The metal was cold against his skin. He turned it over in his palm. Inside the band, an inscription was still visible, worn but legible. Semper Fortis, always courageous. The air left his lungs in a rush. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He knew that inscription. He knew that motto. It wasn't a SEAL motto or a service motto. It was a family motto. Marcus's family motto. He reached into his own pocket, his fingers fumbling with a cold tremor he couldn't control. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, he shook out a man's ring, a heavy silver signet ring he had carried for 5 years. He had taken it from Marcus's hand himself, in the dust and the chaos of that final, failed mission. He held it up in the beam of his flashlight, next to the small gold band. Inside the silver ring, the inscription was identical, Semper Fortis. They were a matched set, a husband's and a wife's. Sargent, who had been watching him with an unnerving stillness, let out a soft sound, a sigh that was almost human. The dog sat, his gaze fixed on the gold ring in Rowan's hand. It was not a growl, not a bark, recognition. The dog's posture was different from any he had seen before. It was a posture of remembering. Sargent had known Marcus. He had known his wife, Sarah. He remembered her scent. That was the scent he had been tracking. Not rust, not decay. Her. The implications crashed down on Rowan with physical force. Sarah wasn't supposed to have been there. The intelligence was clear. She had been evacuated from the embassy days before the collapse. Marcus had confirmed it himself on their last comms check. He had died, believing his wife was safe. But she hadn't been. She had been in that city. She had somehow gotten out. And she had ended up here, in this cold, rusted box, on a forgotten mountainside, counting the days. The guilt that Rowan lived with every day, a constant, low-grade fever, flared into a raging inferno. He hadn't just been too late to save Marcus. He had failed his entire family. He had left her behind. The silence of the mountain was no longer honest. It was accusatory. It had been holding this secret, watching him walk his perimeter day after day, waiting. He slid to the floor of the van, the cold of the metal seeping through his pants. He held the 2 rings together in his palm, a promise made and a promise broken. Sargent rested his heavy head on Rowan's knee, a silent, unwavering anchor in a world that had just been torn from its moorings. He stayed there for a long time, while the light outside faded from gray to a deep, starless black, the silence pressing in, heavy with the weight of years. The first call he made was to the county sheriff. The second, after a long, gut-wrenching hesitation, was to Ben. Ben arrived just after dawn, his old Ford pickup rattling up the dirt track to Rowan's cabin. He got out without a word, carrying a large thermos and a grease-stained paper bag that smelled of bacon and coffee. He was a broad, quiet man, with hands calloused from his work as a carpenter, his face weathered into a calm, steady expression. They had met through a veterans outreach program, but their connection ran deeper. Ben had served under Marcus years before Rowan had, in a different kind of war. He was one of the few people who knew the whole story, or what Rowan had thought was the whole story. He set the thermos and bag on the porch rail. "Heard you had a rough night," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't ask what happened. He just showed up. Rowan nodded, his own voice raw. "Something like that." He told him everything, the words coming out clipped and broken, as he laid the 2 rings on the rough-hewn table between them. Ben picked up the gold band, turning it over in his thick fingers. His face, usually so placid, tightened with a sorrow that mirrored Rowan's own. "Sarah's," he said. It wasn't a question. Sargent found it, found the van she was in. Ben looked over at the dog, who was lying on the porch boards, watching them both with that steady, knowing gaze. That dog remembers more than most people. He placed the ring carefully back on the table. He looked at Rowan, and for a beat, the shared grief was a tangible thing in the space between them. A look of such profound, unspoken understanding passed between them that Rowan felt a sharp ache in his chest, a feeling of being seen that was both a comfort and a wound. He looked away, focusing on the steam rising from the coffee Ben was pouring. "Sheriff's on his way up with a Forest Service investigator," Rowan said, steering them back to solid ground. "They think it's just some old missing persons case." "It's not," Ben said, his voice flat with certainty. "Marcus got her a place up here, a bug-out spot years ago. He never told me where, just said it was ironclad, secure. He was worried about things turning bad stateside. He wouldn't have used a piece of junk like that van." "It was driven there and stripped. Someone planned it," Rowan agreed. "They planned to stay." They sat in silence for a while, drinking the hot, strong coffee. The simple, practical act of care was more than Rowan could have asked for. Ben didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. He just stayed. He shared the weight. It was his way. When the official vehicles arrived, Ben stood with him, a young, competent-looking deputy, and a woman in a Forest Service uniform, who introduced herself as Elena Torres. She had a sharp, intelligent face and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to Rowan's account without interruption, her eyes assessing him, the cabin, the dog. "You said your dog alerted you?" she asked, her gaze falling on Sargent. "He's a retired MWD," Rowan said. He indicated assent. Elena nodded, treating the dog as a professional. "And you knew the deceased?" "I knew her husband," Rowan corrected, his voice tight. "We don't know that she's deceased." A flicker of something, pity maybe, crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. "Mr. Rowan, the state of the vehicle, the time elapsed. It's unlikely." "Check the footlocker," he said, ignoring the implicit dismissal of his hope, "and the hash marks on the wall." She agreed to lead the investigation personally. She was thorough, professional. Ben stayed until they left for the site, a silent pillar of support at Rowan's back. As they drove away, he put a hand on Rowan's shoulder, a brief, solid pressure. "Call me if you need anything. Doesn't matter what time." Rowan just nodded, unable to speak past the knot of guilt in his throat. He watched them go, then went back inside, the 2 rings now on a leather cord around his neck, a cold weight against his skin. He had a duty to Marcus, a duty to Sarah. He would not fail them again. The next day, a different kind of vehicle came up the mountain. It was a late-model black SUV, clean and quiet, that seemed utterly out of place on the rugged dirt road. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a smile that was perfectly calibrated for reassurance. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Mr. Rowan?" he said, extending a hand. "My name is Arthur Davies. I'm with the Viridian Stewardship Group. I understand you found one of our old vehicles on the mountain." Rowan didn't take the offered hand. Sargent, who had been sitting quietly on the porch, rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He didn't growl, but his body went taut, a low, silent warning. Davies' smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered toward the dog for a fraction of a second. "Viridian?" Rowan asked. "That land is part of the National Forest." "A common misconception," Davies said smoothly. "We hold a rather extensive, long-term lease on that parcel for ecological research and heritage preservation. That old ambulance is one of our historical assets, a relic from an old search and rescue program we sponsored back in the day. We're terribly embarrassed it was forgotten for so long." His language was corporate, sterile, designed to neutralize the situation. "There was evidence someone lived in it," Rowan said, his voice flat. "For years." Davies' expression shifted to one of practiced sympathy. "Yes, a tragedy. We believe a transient may have broken into it some time ago. The Sheriff's Department is handling that aspect, of course. Our primary concern is securing our property and ensuring the historical integrity of the site." It was a lie. Every word of it was a carefully constructed, perfectly polished lie. Rowan could feel it, a sour taste in his mouth. The cut straps, the survival gear, the rings. Sarah hadn't been a transient. "The footlocker inside," Rowan pressed. "What was in it?" "Ah, yes. Just some old, corroded survey equipment. Nothing of importance. We've taken possession of all materials from the site for cataloging." Davies' smile was back, impenetrable. "We appreciate your civic-mindedness in reporting it, Mr. Rowan, but Viridian will be handling everything from here on out. For your own safety and to preserve the site, we're asking that you stay clear of the area. It will be marked as private property." The gap between his words and his intent was a chasm. He wasn't asking, he was telling. This wasn't a request, it was a warning. Sargent took a half-step forward, placing himself between Rowan and the man in the suit. The dog's message was clear, a silent line drawn in the dirt. "Your dog seems agitated," Davies noted, his tone still pleasant. "Perhaps it's best if you keep him contained. We wouldn't want any unfortunate incidents with our survey teams." The threat was implicit, delivered with the same placid smile. It was a threat against Sargent, against Rowan's solitude, against his peace. He realized with a sickening certainty that this was not random. It was organized. Viridian wasn't a stewardship group. They were a cleanup crew. They were burying something. They were burying Sarah all over again. "I think you should leave," Rowan said, the words cold and hard. Davies's smile finally tightened at the edges. "Of course. Just remember our conversation, Mr. Rowan. We're all on the same team here. We all want what's best." He turned and got back into his pristine SUV, which drove away as silently as it had arrived, leaving only the scent of exhaust and deceit hanging in the clean mountain air. The system worked exactly as designed. The next day, bright yellow "No Trespassing" signs appeared on the trees around the ravine, citing a Viridian corporate lease number. Elena called, her voice tight with professional frustration. "My hands are tied, Rowan. Viridian produced a lease agreement that's been on the books for 20 years. The site is officially private property. The sheriff has been ordered to stand down. They're claiming everything from the van as corporate assets. The footlocker, the containers, all of it. They're calling it an internal matter." "They're covering it up," Rowan said. "I know," she said, and he could hear the helplessness in her voice. "But they have the paperwork. Without new evidence, there's nothing I can do. The official report will list it as an abandoned vehicle and a probable John Doe squatter case, now closed." The words hit him like a physical blow. Closed. They were erasing her. He hung up the phone, the silence of the cabin pressing in on him. He had failed. Again. He had found her, only to lose her to a wall of corporate paperwork and polite, smiling lies. The old wound, the one he had run to these mountains to escape, tore open, raw and gaping. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He saw Marcus's face, not smiling this time, but as he had last seen him, his eyes filled with a terrible, final disappointment. "You were supposed to get them out, Rowan. You were supposed to get it done." He retreated into himself, into the cold, familiar fortress of isolation. When Ben came by that evening with a container of stew, Rowan met him at the door and turned him away. "I'm fine," he said, the lie tasting like ash. "I just need to be left alone." The hurt in Ben's eyes was a fresh twist of the knife, but Rowan couldn't stop himself. He was toxic, a failure. Everyone he got close to paid a price. He had to keep them away, keep them safe from his own contamination. On the third morning, Rowan woke to find Sargent sitting by the door, his leash in his mouth. The dog looked at him, not with demand, but with a calm, unwavering expectation. His dark eyes were not just the eyes of an animal. They held the collected weight of their shared history, of loyalty forged in fire and loss. The message was clear. Enough. It's time to move. Rowan stared at him, the fog of his guilt beginning to lift, pierced by the simple, profound truth of the dog's presence. Sargent had not given up. He had not run. He was still on the mission. He still believed there was something to be done. That simple, unshakable loyalty was the emotional turning point. It was a hand reaching into the abyss and pulling him back from the edge. He was not alone in this. He had a partner. He got up, his joints stiff, and took the leash from the dog's mouth. "Okay, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Okay, let's go to work." They left under the cover of a pre-dawn mist, circling wide around the main access road to the ravine. Rowan moved with his old stealth, using the terrain to mask their approach. The no trespassing signs were a jarring slash of yellow against the muted greens and browns of the forest. He could hear the low hum of a generator and see the faint, sterile glow of portable work lights filtering through the trees. Viridian's survey team was already there. He found a vantage point on a ridge overlooking the site. 2 men in clean coveralls were loading debris from the van into a commercial hauling truck. They were methodical, efficient, erasing every trace. But Sargent wasn't interested in the van. The dog pulled insistently on the leash, not toward the ravine, but away from it, up the slope to a rocky outcropping about 70 yards from the crash site. His nose was to the ground, his tail held low and rigid. He was tracking again. But the scent was old, faint, a ghost on the wind. Rowan trusted him. Sargent led him to a place that seemed unremarkable, a cluster of boulders and a thick, ancient fir tree whose roots twisted over the rocky soil like gnarled knuckles. The dog stopped at the base of the tree and began to dig, not frantically, but with a focused, deliberate intensity, pushing aside dirt and pine needles. Rowan knelt beside him. "What is it, boy? What did you find?" After a few moments, the dog's paws hit something hard. Rowan took over, using his knife to carefully clear the remaining earth. He uncovered the edge of a waterproof pelican case, the kind used to protect sensitive electronics. It was buried in a shallow hollow, concealed by the tree's massive roots. It had been put there to be found by someone who knew where to look, or by a dog with a memory for scents. He pried it open. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were 2 items, a small leather-bound journal and a digital audio recorder. His hands trembled as he opened the journal. The first page was dated 5 years ago, just weeks after the mission where Marcus had died. The handwriting was elegant, precise, instantly recognizable. It was Sarah's. "They told me he was gone," the first entry read. "They said there was an accident. The men from Viridian were so kind, so sympathetic. They offered to fly me home, to handle everything. They said Marcus had arranged it all as a contingency. I believed them." Rowan's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the neat, controlled script. It was all there. A detailed, devastating log of betrayal. Viridian wasn't a stewardship group. They were a private security contractor. The same one Marcus had warned the brass about. The ones who had been shadowing their operations, profiting from the chaos. They had intercepted Sarah during the evacuation, faking her death and bringing her to this secure location under the guise of protecting her. They told her it was what Marcus wanted. The van hadn't crashed. They had driven it here and disabled it. They had told her she had to remain hidden for her own safety, that enemies were looking for her. They brought her supplies once a month, just enough to keep her alive. They had kept her a prisoner in the name of protection, all to ensure she could never speak about what she might have seen or heard at the embassy. Evidence of Viridian's illegal arms deals, the very corruption Marcus was investigating when he was killed. Her silence was their insurance policy. He found the last entry, dated nearly a year ago. Her handwriting was weaker, shakier. "The supply drops have stopped. It has been 3 months. I think they have decided I am no longer a liability worth maintaining. Or perhaps they have just forgotten me. I don't know which is worse. I am burying this near the old fir tree. If anyone ever finds this, his name was Marcus. My name is Sarah. We were not afraid. Tell them we were not afraid." Rowan closed the journal, a wave of cold fury washing over him. This wasn't just negligence, it was murder, drawn out over 5 years. He picked up the audio recorder and pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the quiet woods, calm and clear, recounting her story for a record she prayed someone would one day find. And then, there was another voice, a recording of a conversation she had managed to capture during one of the last supply drops. A smooth, reassuring voice he recognized instantly. It was Arthur Davies. "We appreciate your cooperation, Sarah," the voice on the recording said. "Marcus would be so proud of your strength. Just a little longer. The world is still a very dangerous place." He had it, the proof, the truth, in her own words. Sarah hadn't just survived, she had fought back. She had planned for this moment, leaving a weapon for someone to find. He was packing the case back up when he heard the crunch of boots on the trail behind him. He spun around, his hand on his knife, Sargent rising with a low growl. It was Ben. He held up his hands, his face grim. "Easy, Rowan. It's just me." "What are you doing here?" Rowan demanded, his adrenaline still singing. "I couldn't stay away," Ben said simply. "I've been thinking about what you said, about that van. It didn't sit right. I remembered something. About 15 years back, Marcus brought me up here. He was looking at buying a parcel of land. He showed me the survey maps. The land Viridian is on now? It was public then. They only acquired the lease 5 years ago, right after everything happened." He pulled a folded, yellowed map from his jacket pocket. "But that's not all. I saw their trucks back then, Viridian trucks, up here, where they had no business being. Years before they had the lease. They were scouting, planning. This wasn't a contingency, Rowan. This was an operation." The pieces clicked into place. They hadn't just taken advantage of a situation. They had created it. They had targeted Marcus and Sarah from the beginning. Rowan showed him the journal and played the recording. Ben listened, his face hardening into granite. The two of them, two soldiers from different wars, bound by loyalty to the same man, now stood together as witnesses to his wife's final testament. "Elena," Rowan said, "we need to get this to Elena." They met her in a small, out-of-the-way diner an hour later. She listened in stunned silence as Rowan laid out the journal and the recorder on the table. She read the last entry, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. She played the recording, and her eyes went wide with recognition at the sound of Davies's voice. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce energy. "This is everything. This is enough to reopen the case. This is enough for a federal warrant." The community, small and tight-knit, rallied in ways Rowan never expected. Elena used the evidence to bypass the local roadblocks and went straight to a federal contact she trusted. Ben, using his connections as a local contractor, found the original surveyor for the land, an old man who remembered Viridian pressuring him to backdate documents. A retired deputy came forward, admitting he had been ordered to ignore reports of strange activity in that area years ago. The truth, once unearthed, refused to be buried again. It was not a violent confrontation. It was a quiet, steady accumulation of facts, of testimony, of a community refusing to look away. Viridian's polished corporate facade began to crack under the weight of Sarah's meticulously documented truth. Arthur Davies was arrested, not in a dramatic raid, but quietly, at his lawyer's office. A few weeks later, after the media storm had moved on and the slow gears of justice had begun to turn, Ben found Rowan on his porch. He didn't say much. He just handed him a small, carved wooden box. "Made this for them," he said, gesturing to the rings Rowan still wore around his neck. "A better place to keep them." Rowan took the box. It was made of dark walnut, smooth and solid in his hands. He opened it. Inside, it was lined with soft blue velvet. He looked up at Ben, trying to find the words, but none would come. Ben just nodded, his eyes meeting Rowan's. In that shared look, there was a quiet sense of closure, of a duty finally truly fulfilled. It was an exhalation of grief held for too long. Relief, gratitude, a bond that needed no name. Ben put a hand on his shoulder, the same solid, grounding touch as before, and then he left. Rowan watched him go, the little wooden box feeling warm in his hands. The crisis was over, but the world was not transformed. Viridian would be tied up in legal battles for years. Justice would be slow, imperfect, but a truth that had been buried was now in the light. That was enough. Rowan took the leather cord from around his neck. He coiled it carefully and placed the two rings, Marcus's and Sarah's, side by side in the velvet-lined box. He closed the lid. He hadn't brought them home, but he had brought their story home. He had borne witness. He looked out at the mountains, the same peaks that had offered him a refuge for his flight from the world. He realized he had stopped running. Sometime in the last few weeks, in the fight for Sarah's memory, he had put down roots without even noticing. He had a place here. He had people. He had a duty not just to the past, but to the present. He would stay. He would see it through. That evening, he sat on his porch steps, the air crisp and cool. Sergeant came and lay beside him, not in a tactical position, not on guard, but fully at rest. He laid his heavy head on Rowan's thigh and let out a long, deep sigh. His work, for now, was done. He was simply present, a partner at peace. Rowan stroked the dog's thick fur, looking up at the vast, star-dusted sky. He thought of Sarah's final words. We were not afraid. He understood now that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear have the last word. It was the quiet, stubborn act of leaving a light on in the dark, of trusting that someday someone would come looking for it. Sometimes God doesn't send a legion of angels to right the world's wrongs. Sometimes he just sends a good dog who remembers the scent of loyalty and knows the way home. And sometimes that is more than enough.